1 o'clock in the morning, on the highest floor of a tower in Chicago, a woman lay asleep on a bed that did not belong to her. She was still in her cleaner's uniform. Her shoes were still on. Her hand still held a cleaning cloth, the way a child holds a toy in sleep. She did not know the door behind her had just opened. She did not know that the man standing there, watching her in silence, owned this room, this entire tower, and carried a name that made half the city lower its voice. In his world, people had disappeared for far smaller mistakes. She was a woman who had arrived in Chicago 3 years earlier with nothing but a small bag and $200 after the last people who shared her blood had taken everything from her, until the only thing they left her was the way out the door. For 3 years, she cleaned floors that ordinary people were never allowed to reach. No complaints, no mistakes. No one could even remember her face. Until the night her body ran so empty that she sat down on the edge of that bed for just 60 seconds, and sleep made the decision for her. The man stood watching her for a long time. Then he did something that no one, not even the men in that room that night, could have seen coming, and it changed both of their lives, forever. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that their story is not over yet. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a powerful story every week. See you in the next one, and God bless you. Behind the man, 2 bodyguards had followed him all the way to the bedroom door, and one of them had slipped a hand inside his jacket with the reflex of men who made their living by preparing for the worst. Salvatore Marchetti didn't turn around. He simply raised one finger. Just one finger, and the entire room went still, as though someone had switched off the sound of the world. In his world, no one needed to speak loudly. They only needed to be understood at once. He stood there a moment longer, looking at the strange woman asleep in his bed, watching the slow, deep rhythm of someone who had sunk very far down, beyond exhaustion, beyond ordinary sleep, the kind of descent that came when a body had been denied the right to rest for longer than it could bear. Then he stepped forward and shook her shoulder. "Wake up, right now." Josephine Whitmore woke so quickly that her body jerked upright before her eyes had fully opened, and in the span of a single breath, he watched her understand everything, completely and with brutal clarity, where she was, what she had done, and who the bed belonged to. Her face turned deathly pale. "Sir." Her voice broke apart. "Sir, I'm sorry. I swear I only sat down for 1 second. I've been working since 10 o'clock this morning. I didn't mean to. Please, sir, please don't. I need this job." She bent down to gather her cleaning supplies, and her hands were shaking so badly that the cloth slipped onto the carpet. She picked it up. It fell again. In another room, with another man. The sight might have been pathetic enough to become almost funny, but here, in the silence that stood as thick as stone walls across the penthouse of Sterling Tower, it only made her fear feel more real, more exposed. "You were sleeping," he said, and his voice was controlled with a precision that made it frightening. "In my bed, inside my private room." "I know, sir. I know. Please, get out," he said. She moved so quickly that she barely seemed to touch the floor, and the door closed behind her with a sound so soft it almost didn't exist. A softness that carried more weight than a violent slam. Salvatore stood alone in the silence. He looked at the bed, at the small hollow in the white comforter, at the faint indentation in the pillow where her head had rested. He looked at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror across the room. A man in an expensive shirt standing on the highest floor of one of the most valuable towers in the city, and felt something he couldn't immediately name. He sat down on the edge of the bed, in the exact place where she had been sitting. The sheets still held the faint trace of her warmth. He thought about her face in the moment she woke. He had expected guilt, the familiar expression of someone caught in the act of doing something dishonest, because in his 34 years of life, he had seen every version of that face, across negotiation tables, in traitors, in people who lied to him and believed they were good at it. But what he had just seen wasn't that. What he had just seen had nothing to do with deceit. It was the face of a body that had run all the way to the end of its road, the face of someone racing toward no finish line, with no cheering, with no one waiting by the roadside with a bottle of water. It wasn't the face of someone lazy. It was the face of someone for whom rest had become a luxury beyond reach. Who works themselves that far, he wondered. What kind of life leaves a human being that exhausted? He sat for a long time in the silent room, longer than a man like him ever allowed himself to remain still. And that night, sleep stayed away from him for a very long while. Then he picked up his phone, pressed a single number, and spoke exactly one sentence before hanging up. Find me everything about the woman who just left this floor, but to understand the woman who walked away from that penthouse that night, one must go back many years to a small town called Millbrook in the state of Ohio, where a building supply store bore the name Whitmore on a wooden sign bleached pale by the sun. Robert and Ann Whitmore had built that store over the course of 25 years, through the steady, patient, joyful labor of people who believed that anything made by honest hands would stand. They weren't wealthy in the way people in high-rise towers were wealthy, but they were rich in the ways that truly mattered, rich in laughter, rich in purpose, rich in the quiet dignity of a family that had built something real with their own hands. Josephine was their only child, and she grew up inside a warmth so constant that she didn't even know to call it warmth. It was simply the air she breathed every day. Her father had a habit that she would only later understand as a gift. Every Friday evening, he sat at the wooden table behind the cash register, opened the worn leather-bound ledger with its softened corners, and called his daughter over to sit beside him. He taught her how to record every payment received, every expense paid, how to check each figure until the two columns balanced. Numbers don't know how to lie, he told her, his voice deep and solid as timber. People do. You remember that. As long as you keep clean books, you'll always be able to hold your head up in front of anyone. She was 10 years old the first time she heard those words, and she didn't know that nearly 20 years later, in a room in another city, standing before people she had never imagined she would meet, those words would return and become the foundation of the greatest decision of her life. That was how she grew up, surrounded by the smell of cut lumber and fresh paint, among customers who called her father by his first name, around dinners where 3 people sat together at one table and no one had to try to be happy. She was 21 when it all stopped. It happened on a November night, after rain had fallen steadily since the afternoon, while her parents were driving home from a trade fair in the neighboring city, the interstate gleaming with water beneath the headlights. On a stretch of road less than 40 miles from home, a freight truck lost control. People later told her that everything had happened in less than a few seconds, that her parents hadn't had time to feel pain, and she never knew whether they said it because it was true or because it was the only thing anyone could say to a child. That night, Josephine was at home ironing clothes and listening to music, doing the ordinary things of an ordinary evening, never knowing that her world had ended on a rain-soaked stretch of highway. She found out only in the early hours of the next morning, when a knock came at the door, and she opened it to find the town sheriff standing there, his hat held in his hands, his eyes carrying the look of a man who had done this many times in his life and had never learned how to bear it. "Child, your parents are gone." 6 words. Only 6 words, and the entire architecture of a life collapsed without a sound. There was no will, because who thinks about a will at 50 when business is good and health is strong? There were no brothers or sisters to share the burden, no living grandparents to lean on. There was only a house that had suddenly become too large, a store that suddenly had no one behind the counter, and a 21-year-old girl sitting in the middle of it all, so hollowed out that she couldn't even cry. On the list of relatives Josephine Whitmore still had in the world, there was only one name: Aunt Darlene, her mother's younger sister, a woman who had always existed at the edges of everything, present but indistinct, the kind of relative people remembered most clearly whenever tragedy struck, and someone needed to appear wearing an expression of concern. Aunt Darlene came to Millbrook within 3 days of the funeral, accompanied by her husband, Uncle Earl, a man whose handshake was too firm and whose smile never reached his eyes. Her aunt took both of Josephine's hands between her own, and on her face was an expression that the 21-year-old girl, still young and emptied by grief, mistook for sorrow. It would take nearly 2 more years before she learned the proper name for that expression. It wasn't sorrow. It was appraisal. It was the look of someone walking slowly around an estate, calculating the value of the house, the store, the bank accounts that had been carefully built over 25 years, and even the value of the niece standing in the middle of it all, alone, shattered, and perfectly easy to control. "You can't stay here alone," Aunt Darlene said, still holding both of Josephine's hands between her own, her voice sweet and warm as a cup of tea already prepared. "Your father would have wanted you to be with family. Come live with your uncle and me. Let me take care of you." Josephine nodded because there was nothing else left for her to do with her head, because grief made every offer sound the same, and because the word family still carried a faint echo of what she had just lost. A few days later, before the funeral wreaths had even finished wilting, Aunt Darlene placed a stack of papers in front of her. A lawyer was there with her, a neatly dressed man Uncle Earl introduced as an old acquaintance, and everything was explained in the smooth, clouded language of people who knew exactly what they were doing to someone who knew nothing at all. "It's only a power of attorney, sweetheart," her aunt said, "so I can handle all this complicated paperwork for you. The taxes, the banks, the transfers. You're still young. You don't need to worry about any of that. You only need to grieve." Those words, "you only need to grieve," would later return to Josephine as one of the cruelest things anyone had ever said to her, because they had been spoken with perfect tenderness, and because they worked. She signed. She signed without reading everything, because the words blurred before the eyes of a daughter who had just buried both her parents, and because who would suspect her mother's only sister beside graves that were still fresh? What happened over the next 18 months was the kind of story that made people uncomfortable, not because it was rare, but because it was painfully ordinary, because it happened every day, in every town, to people burdened with two misfortunes at once, being orphaned, and having relatives who saw opportunity inside that very loss. First came the store. Aunt Darlene told her that the store owed taxes, a large debt her father had hidden from everyone, and that the only way to avoid legal trouble was to sell it as quickly as possible. Josephine didn't know that the tax debt didn't exist, that her father's leather-bound ledger was clean down to its final line, just as he had lived. She only knew to sign wherever they pointed. The wooden sign bearing the Whitmore name was taken down after standing beneath the sun for 25 years. Then came the house. "You can't possibly manage a house this large on your own," her aunt said. "Sell it, and I'll combine the money and invest it for you. Someday, when you marry, you'll have something to begin with." The house where she had grown up, where 3 people had once gathered around a dinner table, passed into the hands of strangers in a single afternoon. Last came the life insurance money her parents had faithfully paid toward for years. The money meant to be the final safety net beneath their only child. It disappeared little by little, in separate withdrawals, into accounts Josephine would learn much later were all held in the name of Earl Hutchins. And this was the part that made the story hardest to swallow. Every bit of it was legal on paper. There was no theft to report, no forged signature to challenge. There was only a power of attorney signed by a shattered young woman, and a married couple who knew exactly how far that paper allowed them to go. By the time Josephine began to understand the full shape of what was being done to her, there was nothing left to save. And when the money ran out, kindness ran out with it, with the precision of a clock. The bedroom with a window where she had stayed during the first few months was cleared for her aunt and uncle's daughter, and Josephine was moved into the basement laundry room, where a folding bed fit between the washing machine and the drying racks. She rose at 5 o'clock every morning to cook, clean, and serve the entire household before anyone else woke. She ate whatever remained after everyone had finished. She wore clothes that no longer fit anyone else in the house. People spoke to her mostly in commands, and sometimes with a quiet kind of contempt that was worse than shouting. The kind of contempt that said she wasn't even worth the effort of raising a voice. Uncle Earl was the worst part of all. He had a habit of standing in the doorway and watching her work, his arms folded across his chest, always finding some reason to criticize her. Too slow, too loud, too ungrateful for the roof over her head, the floor not dry enough, the glass still marked with streaks. And then, as if following a ritual, he would arrive at what he had truly wanted to say all along. "Who did your father think he was?" he would say, making no effort to lower his voice, caring nothing for who might hear. 25 years breaking his back to build a castle out of sand and calling it a legacy. Look at what he left behind. Look at you. Those were the moments when Josephine had to stand perfectly still, both hands clenched around the handle of a broom or the edge of a sink, because she could endure whatever anyone said about her. But hearing someone grind her father's name beneath his voice was a different kind of pain. The kind that made her spine tighten, simply to keep her standing upright. And in the room beside them, Aunt Darlene heard everything, every single word, the only sister of the woman who had been laid to rest, the aunt who had held her niece's hands beside the grave and spoken of family. Not one word, not once, in nearly 2 years, a single word. Josephine endured all of it for nearly 2 years. She endured it because she was 21, then 22, then almost 24, and she had no money, nowhere to go, not a single name in her contacts she could call when everything fell apart. She endured it because the grief of losing her parents still lay over her like a wet blanket, slowing every thought and making it heavy, making action, any action at all, feel impossible, and she endured it because she still hoped, in that stubborn and foolish way only the young can hope, that one day Aunt Darlene would remember who she was, would remember that the girl bending over to scrub the basement floor was her sister's daughter, the niece the whole family had once passed from arm to arm at Christmas gatherings, that somewhere beneath all those layers of calculation, one small piece of conscience still remained and might someday rise to the surface. It never happened. Not once. And the final thing that ended it all was so small it should have meant nothing. On a Wednesday morning, like every other Wednesday morning, Josephine polished Uncle Earl's shoes, one of her daily duties, and left a faint watermark near the toe of the pair of leather boots he treasured most. He noticed it when he picked them up. He walked straight into the kitchen where she was standing, and he slapped her. She stood motionless for 10 seconds, her cheek burning, her ears still ringing, while the kitchen continued to smell of morning coffee and toast, everything around her remaining grotesquely ordinary. And in those 10 seconds, something inside Josephine Whitmore, something that had bent for nearly 2 years beneath the weight of everything that had happened, suddenly became completely, finally, irreversibly still. Not broken, still, like the surface of a lake before a storm, like the moment just before a decision. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't say a word. She lowered her head, finished the rest of her morning work, and Uncle Earl walked away with his boots, satisfied in the belief that he had just taught her a lesson. He didn't know that he had given her a gift, the gift of clarity, because some people find the courage to leave only at the precise moment they understand, fully and without the slightest doubt, that staying means disappearing. That night, after every light in the house had gone dark and everyone had fallen asleep, Josephine packed her things. Everything she owned in the world fit inside one canvas bag. A few changes of clothes, a small framed photograph of 3 people smiling in front of the wooden sign bearing the Whitmore name, and the old notebook where she still recorded her expenses out of the habit her father had taught her. She counted the money she had saved over nearly 2 years. Every coin and small bill from errands she had run for a few kind-hearted neighbors, people who sometimes pressed a little money into her hand, with a look of pity no one dared put into words. Altogether, it came to $200. $200 in a canvas bag. That was everything left of a family that had once owned a store, a house, a car, and 25 years of honest labor. She walked out the door at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, made her way through the dark streets of Millbrook for the last time, and reached the Greyhound station, where the first overnight bus would depart before dawn. She left no note behind, not one line, not one explanation, not one word of accusation. She owed them nothing, not even a piece of paper. The bus pulled away while Millbrook was still asleep, and Josephine sat beside the window, watching the town where she had been born slide backward into the darkness, knowing nothing about where she was going beyond the single name printed on her ticket: Chicago. A city large enough to swallow a human being whole, and large enough for that same human being to begin again, with nothing. 3 years passed after that night. Josephine rented a small room in Pilsen, sharing the hallway with other working people, people who left home before sunrise and returned after dark, people too tired to be curious about one another, and therefore kind to one another in the quiet way of the poor. She found work with Meridian, a cleaning company that served the city's elite, the kind of company that didn't ask many questions as long as you arrived on time and knew how to remain silent, and Josephine was punctual to the minute and silent as a shadow. She worked, she saved, she never complained, and step by step, through the sheer flawlessness of her diligence, she was assigned to the company's largest and most discreet contract, Sterling Tower rising over the heart of downtown, where marble floors reflected the chandeliers like a second sky, where private elevators required private keycards, and where every new employee was taught the same set of unwritten rules on the first day before anyone taught them how to fold a towel. Don't look, don't listen, don't remember. At Sterling Tower, no one explained those rules, and no one asked. But after only a few weeks of working there, anyone with eyes could understand for themselves. From the black cars parked beneath the building with their engines never turned off, from the men standing in the corridors with the posture of people who weren't ordinary security guards, and from the way the entire tower, from the managers to the doormen, lowered their voices by one full note whenever they spoke of the man who lived on the highest floor. That man was Salvatore Marchetti, and the highest floor of Sterling Tower was the only place in the entire building where Meridian was permitted to send exactly one person to work. That person was Josephine. Not because she had asked for the assignment, but because after 3 years, hers was the only record that had passed the background investigation conducted personally by the tower's own people over the course of several weeks. 3 years without a single mistake, a single complaint, or a single moment of curiosity in the wrong place. And in the world that operated above the clouds, a person who didn't look, didn't listen, and didn't remember was an asset rarer than any jewel. Twice a week, she swiped her private keycard, took the service elevator to the penthouse during the hours when its owner was away, worked in silence, and left behind no trace of herself except absolute cleanliness. That night should have been no different from any other. Had fate not begun stacking small events upon one another in the way it always does when it intends to change a life. 2 of her co-workers on the same shift called in sick that afternoon, and their duties were divided among those who remained, without discussion, without extra pay, without a single question about whether anyone could manage it, because that was simply how things worked for the people at the bottom of every tower. Josephine began her shift at 10 o'clock in the morning, and by the time she pushed her supply cart into the service elevator to go up to the penthouse, her body had already endured 14 hours of continuous labor, 14 hours of bending, wiping, scrubbing, and pulling, inside rubber gloves and hard-soled shoes, with only a few pieces of bread eaten hurriedly in the staff break room. The tower's schedule clearly stated that the owner of the penthouse had gone to a private meeting and wouldn't return before the following morning, which meant she had more than enough time. She cleaned the penthouse with the precision of someone who had done the same work 10,000 times, wiping every pane of glass, polishing every faucet, changing the sheets, arranging each pillow in its exact symmetrical position, moving through rooms beautiful in the way only truly expensive things could be beautiful, quietly and without effort, as though beauty at that level were simply the natural consequence of money. At 11:30 that night, she finished, pushed the supply cart back down to the basement, signed out in the maintenance area, and only when she stood in front of her locker did she realize that something was missing. The special cloth reserved exclusively for the stone surfaces of the penthouse. The kind of cloth that was numbered and counted individually. Losing it meant a written report, and a written report at Sterling Tower was something no one wanted in their record. She remembered leaving it somewhere in the master bedroom while changing the sheets. She took her keycard, returned to the service elevator, and went back upstairs for nothing more than a cleaning cloth. And this was where the small gears of fate locked into place. At exactly midnight, the tower's security detail changed shifts. The outgoing shift had written in the log that the cleaning employee was still working in the penthouse. The incoming shift received the log, looked down into the basement, saw that Meridian's supply cart had been returned to its proper place, and reasonably concluded that the cleaner had already gone home, that the note in the log was merely an outdated entry the previous shift hadn't crossed out. No one called to check the penthouse again because the schedule made it clear that the owner wouldn't return until morning. But elsewhere in the city, inside a sealed room whose address no outsider knew, Salvatore Marchetti's private meeting had ended earlier than expected that night, and it had ended in a way that left no one walking out of that room with a satisfied expression. Up in the penthouse, Josephine found the cloth exactly where she thought she had left it, neatly folded on the stone table beside the master bedroom. That should have been the end of it. She should have simply picked it up, returned to the elevator, and the name Josephine Whitmore would have remained forever nothing more than an anonymous line in the attendance record of a cleaning company. But the human body has limits, and that night, hers had reached the very edge of them. After 14 hours, her legs no longer felt like legs, but like 2 heavy masses of dull pain crying out with every beat of her heart. She stood there with the cloth in her hand, and the bed she had just made lay directly before her, smooth, white, immaculate, and silent. She only meant to sit on the edge, only the edge of the bed, only long enough for her legs to stop screaming for 60 seconds. Just 60 seconds before she stood up and went home. That was what she told herself, and it was a completely honest promise. But there are debts the human body records day after day, month after month, without forgetting a single line, and eventually it will collect them on its own, without asking its owner for permission. Everyone already knew the rest of what happened that night. By the following morning, the story had spread through the entire tower before sunlight had even touched the glass panels of the ground floor. Sterling Tower's staff quarters had their own information network, faster than email, more reliable than any official announcement, and crueler than any news report, a network that ran through locker rooms, kitchens, and service corridors where people traded hurried whispers between one task and the next. By 6 o'clock in the morning, every employee in the building, from the garage attendant to the floor maids, had heard some version of what had happened in the penthouse. The Meridian girl slept in Mr. Marchetti's bed, right in his bed, all the way up in the penthouse. They say he came home and caught her himself. That girl is finished. People say someone once disappeared just for spilling wine on one of his rugs, so imagine what he'll do over this. Then someone lowered their voice even further. You remember that driver from years ago, don't you? All he did was speak to a reporter, and no one ever saw him in this city again. The rumors swelled with every passing hour, gaining another detail each time they were repeated, and all of them reached the same conclusion, that the cleaning woman was finished, and the only question left was what kind of ending awaited her. Josephine heard all of it. She heard every word, through half-closed doors, through conversations that suddenly died when she entered the locker room, through glances that flickered toward her and quickly turned away. And she did the only thing she knew how to do, the thing she had learned long before Chicago, during the years inside a house in Ohio where she had possessed no power except the power to keep working, that the safest shelter in a storm was inside the work itself. So she worked. She arrived exactly on time, her face still as calm water, her hands never stopping, wiping, folding, arranging, polishing, every movement as precise as a machine, while inside her chest, her heart beat with the rhythm of someone waiting for fate to knock and not knowing from which direction it would come. She had spent the entire previous night awake in her room in Pilsen, sitting on the edge of her own bed, staring at her hands, calculating again and again how much money she had saved, how many weeks she could survive if she lost her job the next day, and whether there was another city far enough away that a rumor from Sterling Tower couldn't reach it. Fate knocked at 7:45 that morning in the form of a young office assistant, whose expression held equal parts curiosity and pity. Miss Whitmore, Mr. Delgado wants to see you. Right now. Frank Delgado had managed Sterling Tower for 20 years, a man with silver at both temples and a back as straight as a ruler, a man who had begun working for the Marchetti family while Salvatore's father was still alive, and people said there were only 2 men in the tower who had never needed to repeat an order twice. One lived in the penthouse, and the other sat behind the oak desk on the 2nd floor. Josephine entered that office the way a person approaches a final sentence. She had already prepared an apology in her mind, had already folded the spare uniform in her locker so she could return it, had even prepared her answer to the question why, the question she was certain she would be asked. Sit down, Frank said. She sat. He studied her for a long moment across the desk, wearing the expression of a man who had witnessed everything this profession could produce over 20 years and who, for the first time in a very long while, was facing something he didn't understand. Something happened in the penthouse last night, he said, not as a question, only as confirmation. Yes, sir, Josephine said, and she opened her mouth to continue, to apologize, to explain about the cloth, about the 14 hours. But Frank raised one hand to stop her. At 6:15 this morning, the boss called me directly, he said. And I'm going to read you exactly what I was ordered to write down, word for word. He picked up a sheet of paper, and although his voice remained as even as always, there was a very slight pause before he began, the pause of a man still wondering whether he had written it down incorrectly. She keeps her position. No punishment. No one touches her. This isn't a request. Frank placed the paper neatly on the desk as though setting down a piece of evidence. The room was so quiet that Josephine could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner somewhere overhead. During the sleepless night behind her, she had prepared herself for every possible outcome except this one, and now she sat there with both hands resting in her lap, not knowing what to do with the survival that had just been handed to her. Do you understand how rare what just happened is? Frank asked. Yes, sir, she said. I don't think you do, he said. Not yet. He leaned back in his chair. And for one moment, the man who had managed Sterling Tower for 20 years looked at her not as a superior looking at an employee, but as a man who had witnessed many things inside this building and had learned how to read signs other people missed. I've worked for this family since his father's time, Frank said, his voice slowing. 20 years. I've received more orders from the penthouse than I could count. Every kind of order. But an order like this, protecting someone, an outsider, no punishment, no one touches her. He's never given that order for anyone. Not once. He pushed the work schedule across the desk toward her, and before she could rise, He added one more sentence, no louder than a breath, but heavy as stone. So if I were you, I'd be asking myself what I just stepped into. For the next 4 days, Josephine worked like a woman trying to erase herself from the world. She arrived before her scheduled time, scrubbed bathrooms until they shone like mirrors, changed bed linens with the precision of a surgeon, and moved through the corridors without a sound, flawless and invisible, because she had learned long ago that invisibility was sometimes the safest way to survive. The rumors around her hadn't faded. They had only changed shape, from "that girl is finished" to "why isn't that girl finished?" And the second question followed her through the glances in the locker room even more persistently than the first. She answered no one, explained herself to no one, and simply worked. And each evening when she returned to her room in Pilsen, she told herself that perhaps the whole thing would pass, that the strange order from the penthouse had been the end of the story rather than its beginning. On the 5th day, she learned she had been wrong. Frank Delgado found her in the corridor on the 12th floor near the end of the afternoon shift, and he said only 3 sentences, his voice as even as if he were reading a work schedule. "The boss wants to see you. 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, in the penthouse. Don't be late." Then he walked away without waiting for her to ask anything, because both he and Josephine knew that when an order came from the penthouse, the only question permitted to exist was what time. Josephine didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small table beside the window, watching the streetlights spill through the thin curtain, and composed what she would say over and over in her mind. She prepared an apology, complete, sincere, with a beginning and an end, about the forgotten cloth, about the 14 hours of work, about the 60 seconds she had meant to sit down. She prepared a plea as well, in case the apology wasn't enough, about how much this job meant to her, about the fact that she had no family to return to. She even prepared silence, in case both of those things proved meaningless. The next morning, she put on her cleanest uniform, brushed her hair neatly back, and stepped into the private elevator leading to the penthouse, with her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. But when the living room door opened, the man standing behind it looked nothing like any version she had prepared herself to face. Salvatore Marchetti wore a white shirt without a jacket, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a pair of reading glasses pushed back into his hair, and in that first moment, he looked more like a man caught in the middle of a thought he hadn't yet finished than the name that made half the city lower its voice. He stepped aside to let her enter, a small gesture she hadn't expected, then pointed toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit down." She sat with her back straight, balanced on the very edge of the chair, in the posture of someone ready to stand and leave at any moment. And then she saw it, lying on the desk between them, a thin brown file, neatly bound, and although no name appeared on its cover, she knew at once, with the instinct of someone accustomed to having her fate decided on paper, that she was inside it. He followed her gaze and didn't deny it. "Josephine Whitmore," he said, 27 years old, from Millbrook, Ohio. 3 years with Meridian. Not one mistake, not one complaint, not one sick day. The only person authorized to work on this floor. He tapped one finger lightly against the file, then pushed it aside, moving it out of the space between them, as though dismissing something that had outlived its usefulness. "The file tells me what you do," he said. "It doesn't tell me who you are." Josephine remained still, both hands resting in her lap, unsure what she was permitted to say in response to a sentence that wasn't a question. He poured coffee from the pot waiting on the desk, a gesture so slow and ordinary that it felt strange amid the thick tension in the room, then sat across from her and asked the question no one had ever asked her in all 27 years of her life. "If your life had gone differently," he said, looking directly at her, "not here, not this job, not anything that happened to you, what would Josephine Whitmore be doing now?" The question fell into a place very deep inside her, a place no one had touched in a very long time. She opened her mouth to give a safe, modest answer, the kind of answer people offered their superiors, but what came out was the truth. "Going to school," she heard herself say. "Social work. I used to think about it, before my parents died. I wanted to understand the systems that trap people. Why poverty follows some families like a curse while others manage to escape it. Why some children are born into circumstances that were already broken before they ever drew breath, and what it takes to break that cycle." She stopped abruptly, suddenly hearing herself, and felt the blood rush into her face. "I'm sorry," she said. "You didn't ask for that much. I asked exactly what I wanted to know," he said, his voice unchanged. He set down his coffee cup, studied her for another moment with an expression she couldn't read, then gave one faint nod. "Thank you, Josephine. You may go." She stood, bowed her head, and left the room with steps she had to concentrate on keeping even. Inside the service elevator on the way down, after the doors had closed and she was alone, Josephine pressed her palm against the cold metal wall and stood that way for a long time, breathing. To be seen, that was what had just happened to her. Not as a uniform, not as a function, not as a problem to be handled or a burden to be managed, but as a human being with thoughts, with a past, with something inside her worth knowing. She had forgotten that feeling for so long that now, when it returned, it felt almost like pain, like blood flowing back into an arm that had been numb for far too long. She thought that would be the first and last time. But 1 week later, Frank Delgado found her in the corridor again with the same single sentence. "The boss wants to see you." And this time there was no reason attached to it at all. Then the week after that, and the week after that, the summons kept coming. Sometimes early in the morning before her shift, sometimes late in the afternoon, when she was about to sign out and leave, occasionally with some thin excuse offered. A question about the cleaning schedule, about the kind of flowers placed in the lobby. But most of the time there was no reason at all, only that the boss wanted to see her, and Josephine went up to the penthouse with a heart that trembled a little less each time than it had before. Those meetings were nothing like anything she had ever imagined about the man who lived at the top of Sterling Tower. They sat across from each other at the long table, coffee poured into 2 cups, and they talked. That was all. He asked questions, and he listened to her answers in the way of a man who believed what she said was truly worth hearing, without interrupting, without glancing at his phone, without the impatient look powerful people so often reserved for those who had none. And little by little, carefully, like someone opening one door at a time, inside a house filled with locked rooms, he began to tell her things too. He told her that he had lost his father at 19, only that one sentence, no details. But the way his jaw tightened for half a second when he said it told the rest. He told her about inheriting an empire he had never been asked whether he wanted, about having to sit at 19 in a chair that still held the warmth of his father and learn how to make an entire world of men older, more experienced, and more dangerous than he was. Look at him without seeing a boy. He told her about the associate who had betrayed him 7 years earlier, a man he had once trusted as much as he trusted his own right hand, and about the price he had paid to learn that from then on, trusting someone would be a decision rather than a feeling. He told her that he called his mother every Sunday, every single week without fail, and that she always answered before the second ring, because she had done so from the day he left home and had no intention of stopping. When he said that, something very slight changed in his face, and Josephine understood that the man who made half the city lower its voice, no matter how high he stood above everything else, was still someone's son. In return, she told him things too. She told him about Millbrook, about the sun-bleached wooden sign bearing her family's name, about Friday evenings spent beside her father and his leather-bound ledger. She told him about the rainy November night and the knock on the door the following morning. Then, more slowly, more carefully, she told him about the 2 years in Aunt Darlene's house, about the power of attorney signed beside graves that were still fresh, about the store and the house disappearing one after the other, about the basement laundry room and the meals made from leftovers. She told this part carefully, her voice even, her eyes fixed on her coffee cup. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to beg for anyone's pity. She only wanted him to see its shape, the shape of what had happened, without embellishment and without anything trimmed away. Salvatore listened to this part in an entirely different kind of silence. He didn't nod politely or interrupt with soft sounds of sympathy. He sat motionless, his eyes on her, his jaw growing tighter with every passing moment, and when she reached the slap and the overnight bus, the fingers resting on the table curled slightly into a shape she pretended not to see. When she finished, the room remained silent for a long time. He didn't say "I'm sorry." She was more grateful for that than she could ever explain, because she had heard those words too many times from too many people, the automatic little phrase people threw into the silence before changing the subject, and she had grown tired of it a very long time ago. Instead, he said something else. "That family stole from you," he said, his voice calm and clear, as though he were reading a clause from a contract. "That store was yours, that house was yours, that money was yours. Everything they took belonged to you." It wasn't comfort, and it wasn't an attempt to soothe her, only a truth placed on the table between them, straight and solid as a brick. No one had ever said it to her that way before. The kind neighbors back in Millbrook had whispered behind her back that the poor girl had suffered so much. Her co-workers in Chicago knew nothing and therefore had nothing to say. And Josephine herself, over the years, had grown used to wrapping her story into something unfortunate, a piece of bad luck, something that had simply happened. But he called it by its proper name, theft. And somehow that precise name returned something to her she hadn't known she had lost. The right to recognize that she had been wronged, rather than merely unlucky. That night, back in her room in Pilsen, Josephine lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the low murmur of the city beyond her window. There was a strange emptiness inside her chest, and it took her a while to understand that it wasn't sorrow. It felt more like a wound being cleaned, the sting of water touching skin that had been infected for far too long, painful, but necessary. And afterward, for the first time in many years, something might finally begin to grow there. The morning after that conversation, when Josephine opened her locker in the staff changing room, a white envelope was resting neatly on top of her folded uniforms. There was no sender's name, and nothing on the outside to identify where it had come from, but she knew immediately, because there was only one person in that tower who could make an envelope appear inside a locked cabinet without anyone seeing a thing. She opened it with fingers that had suddenly become clumsy. Inside were $5,000 in cash, the bills crisp and new, and a small cream-colored card bearing a single handwritten line in firm, decisive script. For whatever you need. No signature, no condition, no other message. Josephine stood in front of the locker with the envelope in her hand and cried. She cried without making a sound, her shoulders trembling in waves, the tears falling straight onto the tiled floor. And she cried for exactly 4 minutes, because that was all the time she allowed herself. She didn't cry because of the money, but because of those words, for whatever you need, because it had been nearly 6 years since the sheriff knocked on her door in Millbrook. 6 years of finding every meal, every rent payment, every cold medicine tablet on her own. 6 years in which not one person in the world had asked her what she needed. Then she stopped, exactly as she had promised herself she would, wiped her face with the back of her hand, drew one deep breath, and faced her decision. She could return it. The pride inside her, the pride inherited from a father who had lived his entire life without owing anyone a dollar, cried out for her to give it back. But Josephine had been poor long enough to understand a truth. People who had never been poor could never understand that pride was a luxury, and that the line between self-respect and foolishness was sometimes as thin as a banknote. Her room needed next month's rent. The aching tooth she had ignored for 3 months needed a dentist. Her life without a safety net needed, just once, a narrow margin between herself and the edge. She wasn't so proud that she would refuse survival, so she accepted it. But right there, standing alone in the changing room, Josephine made herself a quiet promise. The kind of promise that needed no witness and no document, the kind a person made only to herself and therefore could never be allowed to break. She would earn every dollar in that envelope through honest work and an honest character. She would accept kindness, but she would never, no matter what happened, become something that could be owned, something that could be managed, an object in the life of the man who lived in the penthouse. No matter how everything around her changed, she would remain herself. And at that exact moment, while the envelope was still in her hand, the changing room door swung open. A coworker stepped inside, a woman from the morning shift whom Josephine greeted every day, and they both froze for one long second that seemed to stretch into a minute. The woman's eyes moved from Josephine's tear-stained face to the thick envelope in her hand, to the edges of the new bills showing through the paper, then back up again. Neither of them said anything. The coworker turned away, opened her own locker, and went about her business, while Josephine placed the envelope inside her bag with the slow, unnecessary movements of someone who knew every gesture was being remembered. By lunchtime that day, she understood that the story had acquired a new version. The old rumors about the fateful night in the penthouse had been replaced by another question, quieter and more poisonous. What is that girl to him? No one asked her directly. Conversations simply stopped when she entered the break room. People looked at her half a second longer than usual, and the lunch table where she normally sat lost one person after another each day until she was eating alone beside the window, chewing each bite inside a polite silence harder to swallow than any cruel remark. It was Josephine's first taste of the bitterness of privilege, and it taught her something no book could teach. That grace bestowed from above didn't lift a person up, it only set her apart. She hadn't entered his world, but she had already begun to be pushed out of her own, suspended somewhere between the two, belonging nowhere. But what Josephine didn't know, and what the whispering co-workers didn't know either, was that the rumors in the staff quarters were only the smallest ripples from the stone that had been dropped into the water. Because in the world that moved around men like Salvatore Marchetti, every order passed through many ears before it was carried out. The ears of bodyguards, managers, messengers, and water, no matter how tightly sealed the vessel containing it, always found a way to leak. One story had escaped Sterling Tower and traveled farther than any employee gossip, passing through private dining rooms, cigar lounges, and phone calls never placed twice from the same number. Marchetti ordered protection for a cleaning woman. No punishment, no dismissal, no one touches her. Something he had never done for anyone, not even his own people. And among men who read power the way the blind read raised letters, where every habit of a man was studied like a military map, an order without precedent could mean only one thing. Something important had appeared in Salvatore Marchetti's life. And important things, in that world, had another name: weakness. In the weeks that followed, small changes began to unfold around Sterling Tower, changes so slight that only eyes trained to notice would have recognized them. Unfamiliar cars started remaining longer than usual at the corner across the street, their windows dark, their engines never fully switched off. A gray one today, a black one 3 days later, parked in a different place but holding the same view, the angle that covered the entire entrance to the main lobby. The tower's security men noticed and reported them, but the cars did nothing. No one stepped out, no one broke the law. They simply remained there, patient as animals that knew how to wait. And somewhere else in the city, inside a windowless room, a photograph was developed from a long-range lens, slightly blurred from being taken through 2 layers of glass, but still clear enough. Salvatore Marchetti stood in the middle of Sterling Tower's lobby, pausing to speak with a woman in a cleaning uniform, and he was smiling, not the polite smile the whole city knew, but a real one. To the men who had kept those cars parked on the corner for days, the photograph wasn't a discovery. It was confirmation of what they had already heard through the leaks, that the unprecedented order was real, and that the woman named in that order was real. The photograph was placed inside a white envelope, with no message enclosed, and on the outside, a gloved hand wrote the recipient's address. That address wasn't Sterling Tower. As for the woman to whom the photograph would eventually lead, the entire city needed only to hear her name to understand. Rosa Marchetti arrived at Sterling Tower on a Thursday afternoon without notice and without an invitation, because in all her life, she had never needed an invitation to enter any place where her son was. 63 years old, the widow of a world that didn't forgive weakness. She was the woman who had stood beside her husband through years when every morning she watched him leave could have been the last, who had raised their son alone after the fateful day when he was 19, who had watched him take his father's chair and learn how to make an entire world bow its head. People said there was only one person left on earth before whom Salvatore Marchetti lowered his own, and she didn't sit on any council. She made tea in an old porcelain pot and attended church every Sunday morning. She chose a small table on the mezzanine above the main lobby, ordered a pot of tea, and sat there for 90 minutes, her back straight, her eyes taking in the entire space below, with the leisurely air of a woman merely passing an afternoon. But she wasn't passing time. She was waiting, with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting for things she prayed would never happen. And then she saw it. Her son crossed the main lobby, not in a hurry, not looking at his phone, and stopped midway to speak with a young woman in a cleaning uniform who was pushing a supply cart toward the service corridor. The conversation lasted about 3 minutes. There was nothing remarkable in those 3 minutes, no gesture that crossed the boundaries of propriety. To an outsider, it would have looked like nothing more than an employer speaking with an employee, and yet Rosa Marchetti lowered her teacup onto its porcelain saucer so slowly that it made no sound, because what she saw wasn't in his gestures. It was on her son's face. He was smiling, not the smile tailored for negotiation tables, not the controlled expression he had learned to wear from the age of 20, but the smile of the boy he had once been, the barefoot boy who ran through the backyard, who laughed so loudly the neighbors could hear, the smile she had believed was buried with her husband many years ago. For those 3 minutes, it was fully there. All of him was present in that lobby with that woman. No part of him was somewhere else, inside another meeting or another calculation. And instead of softening, Rosa's heart tightened, because she understood at once what only a mother in that world could understand, that if he smiled like that, then this was real, and real meant complicated. And in the Marchetti world, complicated could get people killed. Because Rosa knew something her son didn't yet know. 3 days earlier, inside the private mailbox at her home, among letters from the church and ordinary monthly bills, there had been a white envelope with no sender's name. Inside was no message, only a photograph of her son standing in the middle of a tower lobby, smiling at a woman in a cleaning uniform. She had sat for a very long time at her kitchen table, with that photograph before her, and she hadn't picked up the phone to call her son. She knew him too well to do that. She knew that if he saw the photograph, he wouldn't step back. He would move forward. He was his father's son, and the Marchetti men had never known how to release anything when it was threatened. They only knew how to hold it tighter. No, this had to be handled another way. A mother's way, quietly, decisively, and without fingerprints. That evening, a handwritten message was delivered to Sterling Tower's staff area and placed directly into the hands of the person meant to receive it. 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, Suite 2801. This isn't an invitation. It was signed with 2 initials. R. M. Josephine stood beside her locker and read the note 4 times, 1 word at a time, and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. She told no one. Not Frank Delgado, not the man in the penthouse, not anyone. At 4 o'clock the following afternoon, Josephine stood outside Suite 2801 in the simple, dark blue dress she had bought at a market in Pilsen and saved only for important occasions, her hair brushed neatly back, her face wearing the composure she had learned to assemble over years of keeping herself upright in rooms where she held no power at all. She knocked twice. The door opened, and Rosa Marchetti greeted her with a smile that held no lack of warmth, a smile that was almost gentle, and that was nearly the most frightening part of all, because Josephine had prepared herself for coldness, for contempt, for every weapon she already knew, but she hadn't prepared for kindness. "Come in, child," Rosa said, stepping aside. The sitting room of the suite had already been arranged with a full tea service on the low table in the center, 2 armchairs facing each other, and Rosa poured tea for them both, with the unhurried ease of a woman entirely comfortable inside her own authority. Josephine accepted the cup with both hands, thanked her, and didn't drink. She sat straight, the teacup resting in her lap, and waited. Rosa began without circling the point, but without cruelty either, speaking in the voice of someone who had prepared every word and believed she was doing the right thing. "You're a beautiful young woman," she said, "and from everything I've heard, very hard-working and very proud. Your parents must have raised you well." "My parents are gone, ma'am," Josephine said, "since I was 21. A brief silence followed, and something genuine crossed the older woman's face, a flicker of sympathy that wasn't false. "I'm very sorry," she said, and she meant it. Then she set down her teacup. "And that, I'm afraid, makes this even harder for you. And perhaps it's also part of the reason my son feels drawn to you. He has a particular sensitivity toward people who rebuild themselves from ruins. But child, listen to me. Not because I mean you harm, but because I'm the only person in this story old enough to speak plainly. My son isn't a man who gets to have a private life. He has never been allowed to be. Every step he takes is watched. Every face beside him becomes part of a story other people read, analyze, and try to use. His world has its own rules written nowhere, and learned only over many years. And the people who live in that world aren't merciful toward those still learning. They don't attack a man's strength, do you understand? They look for the softest place." Josephine remained still, both hands wrapped tightly around the cooling teacup, waiting for the envelope of money she assumed would come next, because she had heard speeches that began this way before, from Aunt Darlene beside a grave still fresh, and she knew where they usually ended. But what Rosa placed on the table between them wasn't an envelope of money. It was a photograph. Josephine looked down, and for 1 second, her breath stopped. The picture showed the main lobby of Sterling Tower, taken from a distance through glass, slightly blurred but clear enough to recognize every person. Salvatore stood in the center of the lobby, turned slightly to one side, saying something. Josephine stood across from him, one hand still resting on her supply cart, her head tilted up, and she was smiling. She remembered that afternoon exactly. He had asked her about a book she had once mentioned, an aimless 3-minute conversation between 2 tasks, one of those small moments she had kept for herself, the way people kept smooth stones they had found. Now that moment lay flat and glossy on the table, captured by a stranger's eye, and it no longer looked like a memory. It looked like a file. "This wasn't taken by anyone who works for me," Rosa said, her voice slow and every word distinct. "It was sent to my private mailbox at home 3 days ago, without a single word enclosed. No threat, no demand, only the photograph." She leaned forward, and for the first time that afternoon, her calm exterior opened just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Not cruelty, but fear. Fear tempered over 40 years into a form of vigilance, sharp as a knife. "Do you understand what that means? A photograph without words means the sender doesn't need to say anything. It means the message is simply that they can see. It means someone out there already knows what you are to my son, before even you had time to know it yourself." Josephine looked at the photograph, at herself smiling inside it, and a slow chill crept down her spine. All her life, happiness had been something rare that had to be gathered carefully, something to preserve. Never, until that moment, had she understood that in the world surrounding the man in the penthouse, happiness could be something entirely different, a coordinate, a mark on the map of hunters. She placed the teacup on the table to hide the fact that her hands were beginning to lose their steadiness, and when she looked up, the question escaped before she could decide whether she had the right to ask it. "Why haven't you shown it to him?" Rosa studied her for a long moment, and in her eyes was something close to respect, because that was exactly the right question. "Because I know my son," she said. "If he learns you're in danger because of him, he'll never let you go. Not out of selfishness, don't misunderstand me, but because of instinct. He'll pull you closer to protect you, place people around you, build walls around your life, and by doing that, he'll bind you to this world forever, with no way out. That's how the men in this family love, child. They love by building fortresses. I've lived inside one of those fortresses for 40 years. She lifted the teapot and poured more into her own cup, even though it was still full, an unnecessary movement to fill the silence. "That's why I'm sitting here this afternoon instead of him." Only then, after the photograph had lain between them and done the work it was meant to do, did the envelope appear. Rosa took it from the handbag beside her chair, a thick white envelope, and placed it on the table next to the photograph as gently as though setting down a chess piece considered long in advance. After the photograph, the envelope no longer wore the face of a bribe. It wore the face of an escape. "There is enough inside to change your life completely," Rosa said, her voice still as even and warm as it had been throughout the afternoon. "Enough to begin again in another city, where no one knows your name, no one photographs you, and no car waits beneath your window. Enough to return to school if you wish, in any field you choose. I asked about you before inviting you here, Josephine. I know what kind of woman you are, and that is why I want you to understand this correctly. I am not insulting you. I am offering you a door while there is still time for you to walk through it." The room sank into silence, a silence so thick that Josephine could hear the low hum of the air conditioner overhead and the pulse of blood inside her own ears. She looked at the envelope resting on the polished wooden table, white, smooth, patient, and in that moment, it wasn't this luxurious suite that rose in her mind, but a sitting room in Millbrook 6 years earlier, the scent of funeral flowers not yet faded, and another woman holding both her hands, speaking in the same carefully prepared warmth about family, about opportunity, about how she only needed to grieve and should leave everything else to the adults. Josephine had signed the paper placed before her that day. She had believed the hands holding hers were shelter, and she had paid for that belief with everything her parents had left behind, with 2 years in a basement, with a slap in the middle of a kitchen, 2 women, 2 tables, separated by 6 years and half a country, one taking everything from her in the name of family, the other offering her everything in the name of protection, and both of them sharing one thing in common. They had already decided for her where her life should go. Josephine raised her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, not with the steadiness of effort, of fingers gripping the edge of a chair, but with the steadiness that came from somewhere deeper than effort, from the place where human beings kept the truths they had paid too dearly to doubt. "Ma'am," she said, "I want to say this with all respect, because you are older than I am, and because I can see that you love your son. I am not arguing with that, but please understand what truly happened. I didn't go looking for him. I have never gone looking for him. I fell asleep in a room I had been assigned to clean, because after 14 hours of work, my body had nothing left with which to remain standing. That is the full extent of my fault in this story. and I apologized for it. Everything that happened afterward was his choice. He was the one who kept me in my position when the entire tower believed I was finished. He was the one who called me upstairs. He was the one who asked the questions. Questions no one in my life had ever asked me. He was the one who chose to look at me as a human being worth seeing in a world that had grown accustomed to looking through me as though I were glass. Every choice, ma'am, was his, not mine. I have never asked for anything. She rose, picked up the envelope with both hands, and for 1 second, Rosa watched her with the expression of someone waiting to see whether her piece would be returned or swept from the board. Josephine did both at once. She placed the envelope back on the table, gently, beside the older woman's hand. A gesture without even the smallest trace of contempt, only the finality of a door being closed properly. I can't be bought, she said. Not by people who hate me, and not by people who mean well. 6 years ago, I signed a paper because I believed my own family knew what was best for me better than I did, and I lost everything, except myself. That is the only thing I managed to keep, ma'am, and it doesn't have a price. If your son decides that I don't belong in his life, I will accept it without resentment, but I will hear it from him, not from an envelope. She bowed her head, a proper bow offered to an elder, then walked toward the door. With her hand already on the handle, she stopped, not turning fully around, only enough for her words to carry behind her. You love him. So do I. At least that is something we share. Then she opened the door and stepped out, closing it behind her so softly that it made almost no sound. In the hallway, Josephine walked 10 steps before stopping and pressing her back against the cold wall. And only then, when no eyes remained to see her, did her hands begin to tremble, shaking in waves she couldn't control, as though the entire weight of the afternoon had come crashing down at once. The composure she had assembled over so many years broke only when no one was watching. It had always been that way, and she stood there in the vast corridor of a world that wasn't hers, one hand gripping the opposite elbow, breathing slowly until the trembling eased, because she knew there was still one thing she had to do that night, and it would require everything she had left. That night, in her small room in Pilsen, Josephine packed her belongings into the canvas bag for the second time in her life. The movements were the same, folding each set of clothes, placing the framed photograph of 3 people standing before the wooden Whitmore sign between layers of fabric so it wouldn't break, laying the notebook where she recorded her expenses on top. But this time was different at the very root of it. On the night she left Ohio, she was running from the people who had hurt her, and every step away from that door had made her feel a little lighter, as though she were gradually setting down a burden. Tonight, she was walking away from the person who had made her happy, the first person in 6 years who had reminded her what it felt like to be a human being. And because of that, every item she placed inside the bag felt as heavy as stone. People often believed that leaving pain behind was the hardest decision a person could make, but it wasn't. Leaving pain required only desperation. Leaving happiness required something else, something far rarer. And Josephine sat on the edge of the bed for a long time among the half-packed belongings, both hands resting in her lap, allowing herself to be completely weak just once before she stood and finished what remained. There were 2 reasons inside her for leaving, woven so tightly together that they were difficult to separate. The first was what she had said to Rosa without realizing she was also saying it to herself, that the only thing she had managed to keep after everything was herself, and she could feel, through the envelope in her locker, through the lunches she ate alone, through the way the entire world around her was quietly rearranging itself to define her by the man in the penthouse, that if she stayed, the part of her that belonged only to herself would slowly wear away, day by day. Not because anyone was cruel, but because that was the law of shadows too large to escape. Stand inside one long enough, and a person forgot the shape of her own body. The second reason had lain on the table in Suite 2801 that afternoon, flat and glossy, showing her own face smiling, a smile that had been turned into a coordinate. She understood now, in the way that made further explanation unnecessary, that as long as she remained close to him, she would remain the softest place in his armor the door patient enemies would try to pass through in order to reach him. And she had decided, there in that corridor with both hands still trembling, that she would carry this second reason alone. She would never write it down and never speak it aloud, so that he would never have to stand before a choice between her and his war, because she knew, with the instinct of someone who had watched him closely enough, that if he were forced to choose, he would choose her, and the price of that choice in his world was one she wouldn't allow him to pay. She sat at the small table beside the window, tore a sheet of paper from her notebook, and began to write. She wrote slowly, without a draft, because she had composed every word in her mind during the walk home from Sterling Tower. You gave me something I hadn't possessed for longer than I dare remember. You looked at me and saw a person. Not a uniform, not a problem, a person. I am more grateful for that than I know how to say, but I can't build anything real while standing inside the foundation of someone else's house. I need to know who I am when I am entirely myself, without the shape of your life surrounding me and defining everything. Perhaps that sounds like pride. Perhaps it is, but I think you understand pride. I think you understand what it means to build from nothing. This isn't an ending. I stopped believing in permanent endings a long time ago. But I need a silence between us. Please understand, Josephine. She read it once, folded the paper into thirds, slipped it inside the last white envelope left in the drawer, and wrote his name across the front, in the careful handwriting her father had trained beside the ledger all those years ago. No address, no added message. Then she lifted the bag onto her shoulder, looked one final time at the small room that had sheltered her for 3 years, switched off the light, and closed the door. On the way to the bus station, she passed Sterling Tower one last time from across the street and stopped at the front desk only long enough to place the envelope in the hands of the night attendant, asking that it be delivered to the penthouse the following morning, no earlier. The attendant looked at the name on the envelope and asked nothing. In that tower, people didn't ask. She stepped back into the night, without turning to look at the illuminated building behind her, and walked toward the bus station with the canvas bag over her shoulder, lighter in possessions than she had been on the night she left Ohio, and 100 times heavier in every other way. The bus left Chicago before midnight. Josephine sat beside the window and watched the city's pools of light grow fewer and dimmer until they disappeared behind her, and she didn't cry. She had already used all the tears she had for that day during 4 minutes in a changing room, on a morning that now felt so distant it might have belonged to someone else's life. She didn't know whether she was making the right decision. No one on that night bus, no one in the world, could have told her. She knew only one thing, that she had to be the one who decided, because the alternative was to remain and allow her life to be determined by one person's kindness, another person's fear, and the calculations of unseen people waiting somewhere beyond her sight, to remain and lose, little by little, so gently that she might never notice, the one thing 6 years of storms had failed to take from her, herself. The following morning, when Salvatore Marchetti crossed the main lobby at 7 o'clock, as he did every day, the night receptionist was still lingering after the shift change, and the man approached him holding a white envelope in both hands, his eyes unable to meet Salvatore's directly, because there are some letters whose weight even the messenger can feel without knowing a single word inside. Salvatore looked at the handwriting that formed his name across the front, careful and orderly, shaped long ago by the discipline of another hand, and something in the way the receptionist refused to look at him told him, even before he opened it, that whatever was inside would alter the shape of the entire day. He read the letter there in the middle of the lobby, standing motionless amid the morning current of the tower. Employees hurrying past, guests pulling suitcases, elevators opening and closing, an entire world moving around a man who stood still with a sheet of paper in his hand, unaware of what had just happened to him. He read it twice, slowly, one line at a time. Then he folded the paper along its original creases, slipped it into the breast pocket of his shirt, directly over his heart, and walked straight to the elevator. But he didn't press the button for the penthouse. He pressed the button for the 28th floor. Rosa opened the door to suite 2801 without asking who was there, as though she had been waiting for that knock since the night before. She sat in the chair beside the window, and in her lap rested the envelope of money, still unopened, still as smooth as it had been when it was placed back on the table the previous afternoon. And on the face of the 63-year-old woman was an expression Salvatore hadn't seen since he was a child, the expression of someone who had once been absolutely certain she was right and was no longer certain at all. "What did you do, Mother?" he asked, his voice very quiet, and she told him. She told him everything, hiding nothing, because that was the only way she knew how to speak to her son, about the previous afternoon, about what she had said and what the young woman had answered, about the envelope placed back beside her hand as gently as someone closing a door, and finally, more slowly, and with greater difficulty, about the other envelope, the one that had appeared in her mailbox several days earlier, about the photograph without a single word attached. Salvatore stood and listened from beginning to end, without interrupting, and the men who had faced him across the harshest negotiation tables wouldn't have recognized the man inside that room, because his anger looked nothing like anything they had ever seen. It wasn't loud. He didn't strike the table. It simply thickened the air around him little by little until Rosa, a woman who had never bowed her head to anyone, had to place one hand against her chest. But when he finally spoke, the anger wasn't aimed where she expected. "Not the money," he said. "I'm not angry about the money. You could have offered her the whole world. I'm angry about the photograph. Someone followed me, photographed her, sent a threat all the way to your home, and you didn't say one word to me. You showed it to her alone, inside a closed room, and then you let her walk out carrying that fear by herself. She is somewhere out there right now believing that her very existence is a danger to me, and she didn't even write that in the letter. Do you understand? She carried it alone so I wouldn't have to choose." He stopped and turned toward the window, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Lower now, more tired, more real, and the bitterest part is that none of this ever needed to happen, because the night she fell asleep in the penthouse, do you know where I had just come from? I had just left a meeting with the O'Rourke family. I went there to tell them I was withdrawing, that this family was leaving the old territories, all of them, one street at a time. For 2 years, I had been moving every part of it into the light, the docks, the restaurants, the real estate, one document at a time, clean enough that the finest federal lawyer couldn't find a single stain. That night was the final piece, and they weren't happy, Mother. Men like that are never happy when someone leaves the table, because the man who walks away is always seen as a man growing weak, and weakness has to be tested. That photograph was their test. They didn't choose her because of who she is. They chose her because they thought I was losing my grip and needed to be reminded that I still had something to lose. The room remained silent for a very long time, and the whole shape of that fateful night, the night the entire tower had whispered about, appeared beneath a completely different light. A man who had just set down the heaviest burden of his life, returning home to find a stranger in his bed, exhausted beyond endurance. 2 people reaching the ends of 2 very different roads, inside the same room, at the same late hour. Rosa looked at her son for a long time, then did something she hadn't done in many years. She patted the chair beside her. He sat down, and for the first time in all those years, mother and son truly spoke to each other, not the Sunday phone calls about health and weather, but honestly, about the father who had died when his son was 19 and hadn't lived to see what he became, about the years Rosa had spent awake whenever Salvatore came home late, about the loneliness of standing at the top of a world where no one was permitted to be weak. Not for one day, not for 1 hour. "I'm tired, Mother," he said, and from his mouth, the words sounded like a confession. "I've been tired for a very long time. I want something clean, a life where I don't have to check the rearview mirror." Near the end, when the afternoon sunlight had turned golden across the window frame, Rosa asked him a question very softly. "When was the last time you laughed, truly laughed?" He thought for a moment. "The other day," he said. "With her, in the lobby." Rosa nodded slowly, and there was no approval in that nod. Not yet, but there was something more valuable. Honesty. "Then go find the girl," she said, "and when you do, bring her home for dinner. Let me try again." But before he could go looking for her, Salvatore had one thing to do first, because searching for someone while cars with darkened windows still waited at the corner was the same as leading hunters straight to her door. He had to close the door on the danger before anything else, and he closed it according to the rules of the world he was entering, not the world he was leaving behind. There were no midnight drives, no messages hissed through clenched teeth. Instead, there were 3 weeks of quiet work by the finest lawyers clean money could hire, thick files prepared with meticulous attention down to the last comma, bank statements, records, and proof of old transactions the O'Rourke family must have believed were buried beneath 10 layers of paperwork, all arranged into a legal wall that any intelligent person could see would bury whoever tried to tear it down before it buried anyone else. Then came a single meeting in a neutral office at the center of the city, held in daylight, with a secretary outside the door taking minutes. A meeting whose contents were known only to those inside the room. No one heard what was said behind that closed door, and no one needed to, because the world only had to read the consequences. The following week, The unfamiliar cars across from Sterling Tower disappeared. They didn't return the week after that, didn't return the month after that, and never returned again. Only then, after Frank Delgado reported that the corner had remained clear for 7 full days, did Salvatore begin searching for Josephine. From the very first hour, he set one rule for himself, and he kept it with the same severity he normally reserved for the most important terms of a contract. He wouldn't use the old machinery, no network of eyes and ears, no men who knew how to find anyone within 3 days, no calls to numbers that were never saved under names, because he understood, painfully and with perfect clarity, that finding her through that kind of power would betray the very thing she had left to protect. If she looked up and found him standing there because of eyes hidden in the dark, then he would have proven she was right to leave, that his world was a fortress from whose sight she could never escape. No, if he wanted to find her, he had to search as an ordinary man, and ordinary men could fail. He tasted that failure 1 week at a time. He knew she came from Millbrook, Ohio, but he also knew from everything she had told him that there was nothing there for her to return to. No house, no store, no relative worthy of the name. He knew her nature, knew she wouldn't drift or surrender, that a woman like her would go somewhere she could be useful, would work, would begin again with her own 2 hands, and he followed that reasoning through cities around the lake, through service companies, employment centers, and places where a hard-working woman might be hired without anyone to vouch for her. There was no trace. What he didn't know, what no line of reasoning could have led him to, was that in the place she had gone, Josephine hadn't used the name Whitmore. On the volunteer registration form at a small shelter, she wrote her name as Josie Corrigan, using her mother's maiden name, the name that had rested quietly on her mother's birth certificate for all those years. She didn't do it to hide from him. She hadn't even been thinking of him when she put pen to paper. It was simply the instinct for self-protection that had settled into the bones of someone whose own relatives had once hunted for her signature, someone who had lost everything because of documents bearing her real name, a reflex that recoiled like a hand that had once touched fire. And so 7 weeks passed. 7 weeks in which Salvatore Marchetti, a man who could summon a board meeting with a single message, relearned the helplessness of searching for one human being across the vastness of America, with nothing in his hands but memories of their conversations. During the 6th week, on a Thursday evening, he sat inside his car parked beside the lake. The engine turned off, both hands resting on the steering wheel, and for the first time in his life, Salvatore Marchetti considered giving up. Not because he had run out of patience, but because a far worse question had begun growing inside him. Whether the very act of searching for her was selfish, whether she might be peaceful somewhere, building her own foundation exactly as she had written, and whether the kindest man he could become was the one who never appeared. He sat with that question for a long time in the darkness. Then the 7th week came, and the answer found him on its own, in the way the most important things in life often arrive. Small, accidental, and almost overlooked. An online community bulletin from a small women's shelter in Milwaukee, the kind of page followed by only a few hundred people, posted a short message thanking a new volunteer. The post explained that the volunteer had started evening classes in practical life skills, that attendance had grown larger than anything the organization had seen in its entire history, and that she was someone, and this was the line that made Salvatore's heart stop for one beat, who had endured losses that changed the geography of a human being, and had chosen to turn them into a road for others. Attached to the post was a photograph taken from the back of the classroom at a slight angle, showing a woman seated inside a circle of chairs, one hand pointing toward a large sheet of paper spread across the floor, only 1/3 of her face visible. But 1/3 was more than enough. Salvatore looked at that photograph for a very long time, longer than he had ever studied any contract in his life. 2 photographs, taken months apart, both capturing a woman who had no idea she was being watched. The first had been sent as a threat, a coordinate for someone to aim at, but this one, posted by people who were grateful for her, was the complete opposite. It was a map leading home. On Saturday morning, Salvatore drove to Milwaukee alone, without bodyguards, without a driver, with no one knowing where he was going except his mother. He parked at the end of a narrow street in a working-class neighborhood, where low fences ran from one house to the next, and the distant sound of a lawnmower drifted through the air, then walked the rest of the way to the address he had known by heart for the past week. The shelter occupied an old 2-story building whose exterior walls had needed fresh paint for years, and several letters had peeled away from the wooden sign above the door, yet the entire place possessed something no glass tower he had ever owned could claim. It was completely alive. Voices carried from a large room farther inside, and Salvatore followed them to an open doorway, then stopped there and stood still. Josephine sat in the center of a circle of folding chairs, surrounded by grown women of every age, people whose stories could be read simply in the way they sat, bodies slightly drawn inward, hands wrapped tightly around paper cups, eyes still carrying the habit of glancing toward the door, as though life had told every one of them, in one way or another, that they weren't enough. A large sheet of paper lay spread across the floor in the middle of the circle, and Josephine was guiding a conversation about what each woman wanted her life to look like 5 years from now. Salvatore stood in that doorway for 40 minutes without stepping inside or making a sound, and during those 40 minutes, he saw a Josephine Sterling Tower had never been allowed to see. She didn't lecture. She excavated. She asked small questions and waited, patiently drawing each answer out of people who had grown accustomed to silence, with the steady gentleness of someone pulling water from a deep well, never jerking, never rushing, simply keeping a firm grip and refusing to let go. She remembered details from earlier sessions, asking one woman about the grandchild who had just started school, another about the job interview she had attended the week before, questions that revealed that between meetings, Josephine had truly thought about every person in that room. She laughed aloud when someone said something funny, and became completely still with her entire body, whenever someone reached a truth that was difficult to speak. And every time one of the women let slip a sentence showing that years of pain had taught her to think too little of herself. "I am too old to learn anything now. Who would ever hire someone like me?" Josephine pushed back, gently, but absolutely, refusing to allow those words to remain unchallenged in the room. "Say that again for me," she would tell them. "Who was the first person to say that to you? And did that person truly deserve so much of your trust?" Salvatore stood there and understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that for the past 7 weeks he hadn't merely been searching for a woman. He had been searching for the very thing unfolding inside this room, the thing she had tried to explain in her letter, and which he had needed to come all this way to witness with his own eyes, a human being standing on ground that belonged entirely to her. The class ended amid the scrape of chairs and the sound of conversation and laughter, and the women left one by one through the side door, several of them embracing Josephine before they went. She turned back to gather the large sheet of paper from the floor, raised her head, and saw him. She froze with the paper still in her hands, and for several seconds, they simply looked at each other across the length of the old room, the man standing in the doorway wearing the simplest clothes he owned, and the woman standing among folding chairs that hadn't yet been put away. "How did you find me?" she asked softly. "You once told me," he said, "that the work you were born to do was for people life had told were nothing. I simply looked for the place where that work was happening." She watched him, and something moved behind her eyes, but she said nothing. He stepped into the room slowly, stopped a few paces from her, and drew a sheet of paper folded into thirds from the breast pocket of his shirt, its edges softened from being carried too long. Her letter. He held it not as evidence, not as leverage, but simply for what it was, something that had rested beside his heart for 7 weeks. "You wrote that this wasn't an ending," he said. "I drove 90 miles this morning to ask what it is. Then," Josephine placed the large sheet of paper on the nearest chair, and when she answered, her voice had regained its familiar steadiness. "I am not leaving this work." "I know," he said. "I just stood there watching it for 40 minutes. I didn't come to take you away from here. I came because I want to expand it. One shelter into many shelters. Evening classes into vocational training, counseling, and scholarships. What you are building with your own 2 hands deserves a foundation and walls." She looked at him for a long time, and in her eyes he saw all of it: hope, caution, and the scars left by every person who had ever tried to design her future for her. "I am not looking for a donor," she said, "who will believe that gives him the right to control my work." "A partner," he said, "not a donor. There is a difference." The room fell silent for 1 beat. Then Josephine spoke slowly and clearly, as though reading the first clause of a contract she had carried inside her for years without knowing it. "Then the first condition is non-negotiable. Every dollar that enters this place must be able to withstand the light, open books, an independent audit every year. Anyone, from the woman who sat in that chair to the most demanding reporter, has the right to open them and look. My father taught me when I was 10, beside a leather-bound ledger, that numbers don't know how to lie. People do. I keep clean books, or I don't do it at all. Salvatore looked at her, and a slow smile spread across his face, the same smile his mother had recognized from the mezzanine above a hotel lobby. That is exactly what I have been doing, he said, with my entire life, for the past 2 years, one document at a time. You are the reason I began doing it faster. And Josephine laughed, one short, genuine, slightly dazed sound, her hand rising quickly to her mouth, as though to hold it back. But too late, her first laugh in 7 weeks echoing among the folding chairs of an old shelter in Milwaukee. 8 months after a man had stood for 40 minutes in the doorway of an old shelter, the name Whitmore House began appearing in newspapers. The program had grown exactly as the two of them had once discussed, among those folding chairs. One shelter becoming 3, in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. Evening classes becoming full vocational training and counseling programs with established curricula. And Josephine, as executive director, worked with the same complete concentration she had once devoted to the floors of Sterling Tower, except that now, for the first time in her life, all that labor flowed into something bearing the name of her parents. A Cleveland newspaper published an article about the newly opened shelter, accompanied by a photograph of Josephine standing in front of the building, with her full name printed beneath it. And the Whitmore name on that newspaper page, together with the figures describing the size of the foundation, traveled farther than she could have imagined, all the way back to a small town in Ohio, landing on the very table of the people she hadn't seen since the night she walked out their door with a canvas bag over her shoulder. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon without an appointment. Josephine's young secretary knocked on the door of her office in Cleveland and said that 2 people claiming to be her family were waiting in the lobby, a middle-aged man and woman, and Josephine looked through the glass wall of her office, saw them, and for 1 second, 6 years collapsed, as though they had never passed. Aunt Darlene's hair had grown grayer, and Uncle Earl looked thinner and more worn inside, a coat frayed at the elbows, but she recognized them immediately, not with her eyes, but with a place somewhere behind her breastbone, the place that still remembered the sound of his footsteps stopping in the laundry room doorway. She stood motionless for 3 seconds. Then she told her secretary to show them in, and everything unfolded like an old play performed again against a new backdrop. Aunt Darlene stepped through the door with tears already filling her eyes, both hands reaching forward. My sweet girl, dear God, look at you. I read the article and couldn't believe my eyes. Your parents must be so proud of you in heaven. She took both of Josephine's hands exactly as she had beside the grave 6 years earlier, and Josephine allowed it, watching with the strange calm of someone viewing a film whose every frame she already knew by heart. Uncle Earl stood behind her, and the man who had once filled an entire doorway now appeared smaller. He wore the same smile that never reached his eyes, and spoke about how difficult business had become, about unfortunate investments, about how family had to support one another in times of trouble, because who else was there? Blood was blood after all. Josephine listened to all of it, and through those circling words, the picture revealed itself. The fortune Earl Hutchins had built with other people's money had collapsed in exactly the way it had been created. One clever little investment after another failing, the house mortgaged, and now, after reading in the newspaper that the niece who had once slept beside a washing machine was running a foundation worth millions of dollars, they had driven through the night to reach her, carrying the only asset they had left, the worn and faded Word family. I mean this sincerely, Aunt Darlene said, tightening her grip on Josephine's hands and lowering her voice to a whisper. There were things I didn't handle properly back then. I know that. But times were so difficult, sweetheart. Now that you've become successful, you could help your uncle and me. We're family. You couldn't turn your back on us. The room fell silent. And this was the moment when anyone who had followed Josephine's story from the beginning would have held their breath, because 2 familiar roads now lay before her. She could collapse once again beneath the weight of the word family, as the 21-year-old girl she had once been, or she could rise and pour out 6 years of buried fury, the slap, the laundry room, the leftover meals, and finally make them hear it all. Josephine chose neither road. She gently withdrew her hands from Aunt Darlene's, walked around her desk, opened a drawer, and placed a business card neatly on the surface before them. It bore the name of the law firm representing the Whitmore House Foundation. This is my attorney, she said, her voice even and clear, not one note louder than necessary. You will soon receive a letter from this office, so I wanted to tell you myself before anyone was surprised. The power of attorney I signed when I was 21 allowed you to act on my behalf. It didn't allow you to take from me. My lawyers say that the difference between those two things, under the law, is worth exactly what you are still holding. The store, the house, the insurance money. Every dollar is recorded, and I am the daughter of a man who kept very clean books. Uncle Earl opened his mouth to speak, and Josephine looked directly at him, only looked, and he closed it again. Anything that is recovered, she continued, won't go into my pocket. Every bit of it will go into the foundation. For the women outside this office who have no one willing to stand up and reclaim what was taken from them. I no longer need my parents' money, but I owe my parents the duty of not leaving it in the hands of people who spoke about my father in words you both remember better than I do. She walked to the door and opened it, holding it wide with perfect courtesy. Beyond that matter, we have nothing left to discuss. I wish you a safe journey back to Ohio. The two of them rose, visibly aged by the 3 minutes that had just passed, and walked past her into the hallway, neither one daring to meet her eyes, exactly as she had once been unable to meet theirs. Josephine closed the door, stood still for one beat, and then noticed something that made her look down. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, quiet, warm, and completely steady. For the first time in her life, standing before them, her hands didn't tremble. That night, the final night before the official opening of Whitmore House, Salvatore called her, and in the middle of their conversation, he asked, "Are you afraid? About tomorrow? The cameras? The press? All of it?" Josephine looked through the window of her small apartment in Cleveland, where the city lights stretched out like an unfinished promise, and she answered, "Yes," she said, "of course I am, but it is the fear of someone standing before a beginning, not the fear of someone standing before a closed door. I have lived half my life with the second kind, so I know the difference." The following morning, beneath the clear blue sky of an early summer day, the official opening of Whitmore House took place simultaneously in 3 cities, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Cleveland, 3 shelters and vocational training centers for adult women in need of a new beginning, all bearing the family name that had once appeared on the sun-faded wooden sign of a building supply store in Ohio. The first line of the press release said nothing about the size of the foundation's funding. It spoke instead about its principles: open books, independent audits every year, and the right of anyone to examine the records, because the woman running it was the daughter of a man who had once taught her that numbers didn't know how to lie. The main ceremony took place in Chicago, in the wide courtyard before the building, and among the rows of chairs, the bouquets of flowers, and the television cameras, was a sight no script could have arranged. In the sunlit yard beside the building, the young children of the women enrolled in the programs were playing with brightly colored balloons, running in circles and laughing, and the clear sound of their laughter drifted through the open windows and entered the ceremony like a promise of the future. A promise that this place had been built not only for their mothers, but also for the young lives that would grow up inside a world different from the one their mothers had endured. Then came the questions from the press, and among the polite inquiries, one reporter rose with a notebook in his hand, and skepticism only thinly concealed in his voice. "Mr. Marchetti, with all due respect, a foundation of this scale is usually managed by people with degrees in administration and experience running organizations. What qualifies a former cleaning employee to lead it?" The courtyard fell silent for one beat. Salvatore didn't answer immediately. He turned fully toward the reporter, looked him directly in the eye, and when he spoke, his voice was so calm that every word fell with the clarity of a stone placed on a table. She lost everything at 21 and rebuilt herself from nothing in a city that wasn't waiting for her. She walked away from a family that had taken everything she owned without carrying a single dollar that didn't belong to her. She refused money from my own mother, and I might add, not many people can do that. She began this work with nothing but her own 2 hands, without a dollar of funding, inside an old shelter whose walls needed painting, before I ever had the chance to offer her anything. She understands the women who walk through those doors better than any degree could teach, because she was once one of them. If that doesn't qualify her, then I don't know what qualification means. No one asked another question about it. And in the front row, a 63-year-old woman, in an elegant outfit, quietly adjusted the fold of her scarf, her lips pressed together against something that looked very much like tears. She had arrived early, before any of the guests, and in the small room behind the stage, Rosa Marchetti had taken both of Josephine's hands between her own, the 3rd time in the young woman's life that an older woman had held her hands that way, but this time was entirely different from the first 2, because there was no appraisal and no bargain in it. The hands only trembled a little. I was afraid of what I didn't understand, Rosa said softly. Now I am trying to understand. That is all I have. Josephine gently tightened her hands around Rosa's. That is enough, ma'am, she said. More than enough. That evening, after the cameras had been switched off, the flowers had been carried inside, and the lights had come on across all 3 cities, 2 people left everything behind and sat inside an old late-night diner on the south side. The kind of place that had been open since its first owner was still young, with worn red vinyl seats, weak coffee poured from glass pots, and apple pie warmed inside an aging oven. There was no tower, no bodyguards, and no one in the diner knew who they were, which was precisely why they were there. Josephine looked through the window at the night street flowing past, headlights moving through the darkness, late shift workers making their way home, an entire city that stopped for no one and promised nothing to anyone. And she spoke in a voice so soft it was almost as though she were speaking only to herself. My father had a saying. He used to say it whenever business was slow or something went wrong at the store. A road that seems to be taking you in the wrong direction is sometimes the only road that knows the way home. Salvatore remained silent for a long time, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone half cold. He sounds like a wise man, he said. He was, she replied. He truly was. And they sat there at the plastic table of an ordinary late-night diner, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a city after dark. 2 people who had found each other through the most unlikely door, needing to be nothing other than themselves, and that was enough. In truth, that was everything. And the lesson of this story, ladies and gentlemen, isn't that one day a powerful person will appear and rescue your life? The lesson is what Josephine Whitmore already knew before Salvatore Marchetti ever entered hers. What kept her standing through the basement laundry room, through the meals made from leftovers, through 14 hours of work and the cruelest rumors, that your worth isn't determined by what has been taken from you. It isn't determined by the relatives who once called you useless. It isn't determined by the rooms where people told you that you didn't belong. You were never nothing. You were always everything. The world was simply late in recognizing you, and it always catches up with those who refuse to let its smallness become their own. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that their story isn't over yet. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more compelling and deeply emotional stories every day. And what did you think of this story? Which moment touched you most deeply? Please share what is in your heart in the comments below. We sincerely look forward to reading every word you have to say. Thank you for staying with us until the final moments of today's story. May you and those you love always enjoy good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and serenity. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.